Thrall by Carmen Henderson. Chapter 1. My name is Thrall Arneson, and I was born with a club foot. "Kill him," said the old hag who served as the village midwife, "or take him up the mountain and leave him for the wolves to deal with." All this I learned from my father many years later. "He's no good," the midwife had told him, handing him the screaming bundle that was me. But my father looked into my face and saw my blue eyes staring into his, and his heart was lost. "You looked like a wise old man," he told me, "and there was nothing wrong with your lungs." The midwife finished clearing up after my birth, saw that my mother was all right, and ducked under the low lintel of the doorway into the frost-bound night. "Mark my words," she said as a parting shot, "he'll give you nothing but trouble." My father and I sat on a rocky outcrop halfway up the mountain overlooking the village, which straggled along the small strip of flat land along the fjord, and he told me of my early years. I was 10 by then, and it was high summer, and the deep water beneath sparkled in the noonday sun. Behind us our 3 cows grazed on the lush grass in a little hollow cradle of land, and we heard the swish, swish, as they wrapped their tongues around the grass and tugged up a mouthful. All around was the scent of pine trees, and in the cloudless sky above a family of sea eagles, 2 parents and a youngster, circled overhead in the rising currents of warm air, their screaming cries thin and faint to our ears. "Why was I no good?" I asked. "Was it because of my foot?" "Yes," he said. "The midwife thought you would never grow up to be a proper Viking, or even a farmer with a club foot. She thought you would be unable to move and become just another useless mouth to feed." He smiled and turned his brown face, with its long dark beard and deep blue eyes, towards me. "But we've proved her wrong, haven't we?" I shifted my foot in the special boot my father had made and nodded. "And now I can make my own boots," I said. I had watched him enough times as I grew, cutting out the leather, piercing the holes and stitching the bits together, with the extra padding of sheep's wool inside on the outer edge of my right foot, so that where it turned inwards I felt no pain. True, I would never walk as well as other children with perfectly formed feet, and I could barely run, but my limp was not so bad that it stopped me from doing anything. "You spoil the child, Arne," said my mother Sissel, but my father shook his head. "Who else will teach him all he needs to know when we are gone?" he said, and there was no answer to that. So he taught me useful skills, and others I picked up for myself. I learned how to hunt with the bow and arrows, though I would never be strong or agile enough to wield a sword like a warrior. He showed me how to snare small animals, fish for herring and cod out on the fjord, and how to be wise in the care of farm animals and all matters of farming. Cloudberries and wild raspberries grew in the forests and fells above the village, and my mother showed me which herbs she wanted for cooking and healing. As I became older, I managed an axe easily and could chop wood and kindling for the fire. One skill I found unexpectedly was that of wood carving. My younger sisters, Berit and Ailin, would pester me constantly for the little animals I would fashion out of spare lumps of wood, using the lie of the grain to show muscles and fur. Somehow the creatures would spring out of the wood before my eyes, with little help from me, as if I was just releasing them from their woody prison. When I was barely 12, I was taken to the forge of Einar the smith, after my father asked if he would teach me how to hammer iron into household objects and to temper steel to make swords and spearheads. Einar was a friend of my father, a thick-set, burly man with huge calloused hands and burn scars up and down both arms. I was frightened to begin with. The flames roared and the iron glowed white in the furnace, and when Einar took the metal rod out of the fire, I could hardly lift the weight of the hammer to hit it hard enough. Over the months I grew stronger, and I found the work easier. I was tall for my age, and the exercise in the forge made the muscles in my arms and back thick and resilient. Einar and I would work with a rhythm, each of us with a hammer, thumping the metal flat, one after the other, and how the sparks flew. If they landed in my hair, Einar would swipe them off with his hands so that it didn't catch fire. To start with, I made simple things of iron: nails, sickles and scythes for cutting the barley and rye at harvest time. Sometimes I would make cauldrons of different sizes for cooking and other household implements. By the time I was 13, I learned how to smelt iron into steel, good enough to make knives and sword blades, how to pour off the impurities until only the best grade molten metal was left. I made mistakes over and over, and Einar would shake his head and laugh and tell me that all was not lost. The metal could be melted down again and reused. Little by little I mastered the craft, which seemed to come naturally to me. "You could run your own forge soon," Einar said one day, as he plunged a newly formed blade into the barrel of cold water to cool and harden it. "Another year or two and you will have perfected everything I've taught you. You have an eye for a good sword." He turned to the grindstone to begin the delicate task of sharpening both sides of the steel, handling it as gently as one would a small child. When I told my parents, they laughed at my youthful pride. "It's a useful trade," my father acknowledged. "You will never be without the means to support yourself wherever you go." The idea of going anywhere else had never occurred to me. My world was the fjord, the village, the mountains which rose above us, white with snow in the winters, green with the forest in summer. Often my father and I would go out in our boat, which was usually run up on the shingle beach. The fish we caught and split and gutted, and hung them on wooden frames to dry in the wind. They would see us through the lean times of winter. Sometimes we would sail right down to the fjord mouth, and I would look up and down the coastline to left and right, marvelling at the endless sight of mountains and water and islands, some so small they barely showed their heads above the water. "What lies out at sea beyond here?" I asked my father, who laughed. "More sea, I expect," he said. "I've only been round the headland to the north, into the next fjord, and the one after that, and it's much the same as this one." "Wouldn't you like to go further?" I asked. "Not particularly," he said, after a few minutes' thought. We both tugged on the oars, turning the prow back into our own home waters. My father was a happy man, content in his own skin and with his own family. I wasn't so sure I could be like him in that way. There was a whole world out there waiting to be explored. Of course I would never go away permanently, but sometimes I did wish I could see other places and people. Just down below our house there was a wooden jetty that stuck out into the water, long enough for one of the canals or trading ships that would occasionally nose their way up the fjord from the sea beyond. They brought iron ore for Einar, sealskin hides to make ropes, and sometimes bits of copper or silver jewellery, which the women loved. From our village they took lengths of timber and deer hides, wolf and bear pelts, and dried stockfish. Once a Viking longship, bristling with warriors with shields and weapons, drew up to the jetty, needing repairs to the planking of the upper strakes, where they had been damaged. The whole village turned out to stare, and to offer them refreshment when it became clear they were not in Helmsdale to raid and plunder. My mother's brother Svein was a trader and a rich man, according to his tales of the long, dangerous voyage he had made. He visited us 2 or 3 times a year, sailing into our fjord to see his sister and show us what an important and wealthy man he had become. "You should come with me, Anna," he said to my father. He had called at Helmsdale on his way south from the north of Norway, where he had picked up a cargo of reindeer hides, walrus ivory, whalebone, barrels of salted herring and eider feathers. These he was taking south to Denmark in exchange for malt for brewing, sealskins, fur, salt meat and iron ore. "I go to England with these things and other things," he boasted. "My ship Slider is a strong boat, well built. I paid a lot for her." My father never gave any indication that he might take up his brother-in-law's offer. From the shadows at the edge of the circle around the fire in our house I watched Uncle Svein. I never felt completely comfortable with him. He was so different from my mother, who was quiet and modest in all she did. Svein was loud and brash and would draw my sisters to him and smother them with kisses, taking no notice of how they wriggled and struggled to get away. Me he just ignored or gave a passing nod. I wondered whether, if I had been his son, he would have followed the midwife's advice and have me put out on the mountains for the wolves to kill. I felt he didn't like me, especially after the time I found him with Berit round the back of the small barn where we kept the hay and farm tools. He had his arm round her and his hands moved over her body. She was a polite girl and had not cried out to stop him, but she ran to me in obvious distress. He gave me a look of pure loathing, and I was always glad when he left. One morning in the early spring, a few weeks after my 14th birthday, I sat on the jetty and dangled my feet over the grey water that heaved and dropped under the wooden planks. Einar had shut the forge for a few days while he went over the mountain to visit his family in the valley that ran parallel to ours. It would be a long, hard climb, and there would be much snow still at the top, but Einar was cheerful as he set off. "Enjoy some free time, Torkel," he said. "Go fishing, play with your sisters, help your father." With a wave of his hand he strode off up towards the tree line, where the path disappeared from view. I didn't feel like doing any of the things he had suggested, least of all play with my sisters. The day was overcast, and the tops of the mountains on either side of the fjord were shrouded in mist. The waterfall, which tumbled down the side of the mountain opposite to where I was sitting, seemed to erupt out of the cloud itself, though of course I knew that the torrents of water were the result of snow melt higher up. A small wind caught the edges of the fall and swept them up like smoke from a fire. Behind me I could hear the sounds of village life. Small children playing, cows lowing, impatient to be milked, women chattering as they went about their daily tasks. My father was out in the small field behind our house with his plough, getting the ground ready for sowing the barley that my mother would harvest with him and grind into flour for our bread. "Shall I help you?" I asked before he left. The ard was a heavy wooden plough and sometimes difficult to manage, but he shook his head. "No," he said, "Gunnar has said he'll come if I would do the same for him." So I was free to amuse myself. The girls were indoors with my mother, learning how to weave on the loom that stood at the end of the house, and which my mother was at for some part of most days. All our clothes came from the materials she wove from the wool of our sheep, though our best clothes were made of linen. I threw small pebbles into the water, listening to the satisfying plop they made, when a movement to my left caught my attention. A ship was rounding the bend in the fjord, and with not enough wind to enable the crew to use the sails, rowers were hard at the oars. My heart sank as the boat approached. It was Slider, which meant another visit from Uncle Svein. I jumped up and hobbled back to the house. "Uncle Svein is coming," I shouted to my father before going inside. "Uncle Svein," I began, and my mother raised her hand and laughed. "I heard you," she said. "My brother is visiting us again." Berit and Ailin folded their arms, and Ailin's frown could have soured milk. At barely 8, she wasn't yet able to disguise her real feelings. Berit, just 3 years older, was more able to keep things to herself. "Not him again," she said under her breath, and though I said nothing, I felt the same. "Hush," said my mother, getting up from the loom. She dusted herself down, patting her hair under her cap. "He always brings us something nice." I went out again to watch Slider draw up to the jetty. There were about 14 men in the boat besides my uncle, and the steerboard man, a big, ugly brute, with a shaven head and scars running down his sword arm from the elbow to the wrist. "Tie her up, Alfmund," said my uncle, as he jumped from the ship onto the jetty. The man grunted some commands to the other on board, and they shipped their oars and made fast alongside. Uncle Svein turned towards our house and saw me watching. "Ah, Torkel," he said, climbing up the slope towards me. "My word, you've filled out since I last saw you." He looked me up and down as if I were a prize bull at a market. I avoided his outstretched hand and motioned for him to go ahead of me up to the house. "Mother will be pleased to see you," I said, remembering my manners. My father reached the doorway at the same time as Svein, and like me did not offer his hand to shake, but at least he had the excuse that his hands were covered with dirt. Come in," he said. "Sissel will be pleased to see you." I took my sisters out, telling them I needed their help in the sheep pens, where our 10 ewes were almost at the point of lambing. They followed me gratefully. "How long is he staying?" asked Berit. Her grey eyes were anxious under her fringe of soft brown hair. I shrugged. "I don't know. As short a time as possible, I hope." I knew she liked Uncle Svein as little as I did. We stayed out there as long as we dared, but in the end, a shout from my father brought us back indoors.